Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel with this beautiful ground orchid today. But before we get to that, let me tell you what I am, who I am and what's going on here. I tried to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without the help of any grow lights, humidifiers, equipment, greenhouses of any sort, really just me and them growing outdoors or indoors or not at all. Many a mistake made on the way, plant lovers, but if that sounds like your bag, hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday and you can join my rambling adventures, which today takes us to the southernmost tip of Japan. And in fact, a few other spots as well, but Japan makes the whole thing sound more contained and romantic. So without further ado, let us jump into the subject of this video, which is this gorgeous ground orchid. It's a Calanthe and it is aristulifera, I think is how one pronounces that. Who knows? Now, I have made a video about this in the past, I think, but this year it is just looking stunning with 4 flower spikes, which I've never had before. So there's a bit to talk about this. So I thought, why not? Let us film it again and just revisit, as Evelyn Waugh may have said, this gorgeous orchid. First things first then, Calanthe. So that's a group of terrestrial orchids which actually sort of spread all the way around the world in the equator. So there's some in Australia, there's some in northern South America, there's a lot in Africa, a lot in Asia, sort of that equatorial band. And this one grows on the southernmost island of Japan. It grows in Taiwan, parts of southeastern China, and parts of Korea too. And it's a bit of an altitude plant, so it can take cooler temperatures. It's described as a cold grower, but a lot of those places are actually subtropical, but it is a high altitude plant, which means it will be cooler. So it wouldn't be dissimilar for an Australian context for the Blue Mountains next to Sydney. So Sydney is a subtropical environment. You have the Blue Mountains right next to Sydney, and at the top of those mountains, very, very different climate. But of course, you know, connected, just different. That is where this one comes from. And apparently, aristulifera is quite rare in cultivation. Whenever I look at it, it's always rare, the uncommon, the infrequently found. Anyway, so lucky me. And in fact, the person I bought this off no longer trades. She was a specialist in rare perennials, particularly ephemerals and sort of woodland plants. So not an orchid specialist at all. And yeah, she's just given up because she doesn't want to anymore, which is unfortunate. So I'm not sure how or where you would find this, perhaps joining an orchid club. Now, the great thing about this sort of orchid for me here is that basically I just treat it as you can see, a potted plant outside all year. So in its natural habitat, it's growing in quite elevated, high altitude positions, but it is basically a sort of a woodland perennial plant. So it's getting dappled light, not deep shade, but certainly not harsh afternoon sun. The leaves are quite delicate and it will burn quite quickly. And in fact, these leaves don't look too dissimilar to peony leaves actually. And oddly, given the size of this plant, the size of a peony leaf can often be quite similar. Anyway, that's, I think, the limit of their association. So this is not herbaceous, so it doesn't die down in winter and regrow in spring. The old leaves, as you can see from the previous year, remain, and you can see how scabby they get. You can also see slugs and snails love them, but we'll get to that. And then in the spring, you get your new growth like this, and in the center of that emerges the flower spike. So in terms of growing this as a potted plant, I think outdoors is best. If you have particularly cold winters, then maybe bring it in, and then the minute it's above freezing, maybe take it out again so it can have that sort of natural outdoors spring environment. Luckily here in Melbourne, we don't get below 0 centigrade, 32 Fahrenheit very often, if ever. So in the city centre, this plant is perfectly hardy for my conditions. Now, the other thing about this particular one is that I was told it was very slow to clump. And that is true. I think this plant is now 3 or 4 years old. And when I bought it, it was just 1 crown and 1 grow point, and I had 1 bloom. I think I've had 1 flower for the last few years. I think last year it may be 2. But this year, it's just put on the most stunning amount of growth and produced 4 new growth points, all of which have spiked for me and produced flowers. So I'm really thrilled. It's obviously really starting to get into its own. Now, potting mix wise, it is basically like a woodland perennial. So if you were to grow, say, trilliums or podophyllums or anything like that, it would be the same sort of mix. So a loose mix full of lots of gorgeous organic matter. And if you wanted to, you can use an out-of-the-bag orchid mix as the base, maybe 50 to 60% of that, and then maybe the balance being a really beautiful, rich compost. Imagine it's terrestrial, underneath lots of falling leaves, so there'll be all sorts of delicious things decomposing around its base. So here we are, it is the first days of spring and this gorgeous flower has sprung into life. So it is a spring bloomer and the leaves then mature and it's not an unattractive leaf, a bit like maybe an aspidestra. So it's kind of an attractive potted plant, also maybe like hostas as well. And in fact, it has a pretty similar life cycle to hostas, I think, in terms of when it grows and flowers and blah, blah, blah. So very, very handsome in a pot, even when the flowers have gone. So when the flowers do die, I will trim them off and leave the leaves. But before we get to the flowers, what I'm also going to do is, as I mentioned, you have your leaves. It's not deciduous, so those leaves remain. Then the new growth emerges, and this leaf will basically stay here until it gets really ratty and brown and then fall down, decompose. But that could take another year. So if you want to tidy up your plant, get yourself some clean secateurs, and I am just going to trim off these old leaves. So they are still photosynthesizing, so I wouldn't strip it bare, but they are, particularly that one, look, really unsightly. So I'm just snipping those right down to the base. There you go, that is our dead leaf. And then what we're going to be left with, let's take off that one, and maybe we'll take off this one. So what we're left with now is this beautiful, beautiful fan of gorgeous new growths, ready to mature and do their thing. So let's take a look at the flowers. They are the most beautiful sort of pale lilac and really, really delicate. Oh, we actually didn't talk about the origin of the name. So Calanthe comes from the Greek, kalos and anthos, meaning beautiful flower. And the aristulifera, I think aristatus can refer to being bearded or bristly. So I think it might refer perhaps to some sort of beardy or bristly moment in the flower. I can't really see, but anyway. Nomenclature often leaves me cold and somewhat bemused, but really who cares? That's the nature of the beast. There are some Calanthes native to Australia, and I actually saw them once. I actually saw the remnants of the plant and the seed pods on Hamilton Island, which is an island to the very southern tip of the Great Barrier Reef off the east coast of Australia, and it was thrilling to see that in situ. In fact, that one was growing in shaded glades on the banks of permanent streams. So a moistish, foresty, understory sort of plant, but still getting bright dappled light, but no direct sun. So the flowers are really, really beautiful. And just in terms of form and spike, I think it does look like a lot of other terrestrial orchids that you would find in Europe, for example, when you have that central spike coming out of a cluster of leaves and then the flowers arranged at the top of the spike like this. Now mine's only just begun to open, so there's plenty more buds at the top, but I've got 4 this year. I'm very, very excited. Now it's been in this pot for all those years, and what I do every late winter is I just put a smallish layer of manure on the top, so out of the bag poo. So whether it's horse, cow, chicken, whatever, but whatever you get from a nursery or a hardware store is fine, and a little bit of slow release fertilizer. So I really load it up in spring to give it all the oomph it needs to produce as many growth points as possible. And then I don't really feed it much throughout the rest of the year. If I'm in the neighborhood and I've got a watering can and there's some liquid fertilizer in it, I'll give it a bit of a splosh, but generally not. And where mine is, it does get quite beautiful morning sun, but then it's very, very protected. And it's kind of a bit protected by a bit of a shrub as well, which is kind of replicating the natural habitat it would grow in. So it's sheltered, and it's particularly sheltered from the afternoon sun, because here in Australia, that can be vicious and very burny. And a lot of orchids, a lot of plants, do not respond well to a hot afternoon sun, just saying. No real fragrance to the flowers, but who cares? It is so delicate and beautiful. Now, when we move, this is the sort of plant that I would put on an outdoor table near the kitchen window so you can look out at it. I don't think it's going to fare very well bringing it indoors to enjoy the blooms, unfortunately, but a wonderful thing to have outdoors. Now, if you've got the right climate, which doesn't really freeze, you could plant this absolutely out in your woodland garden, as long as it was somewhere where you could see it and kind of contain it. So the only sort of caveat, I think, is that whole slugs and snails thing, a bit like hostas actually. When the new shoots emerge, they are very juicy and tender and the perfect kind of nibble for a slug or a snail. So do be wary of that. And if you've got it in pots, you can also elevate the pot for those first few weeks while the new growths are emerging. And then, as we saw over time, the old leaves are going to get really ratty. So this one has been munched by many a thing, probably a few caterpillars as well. So at the end of the season, you can trim those. This is going to photosynthesize brilliantly from its new growths. And in fact, it's kind of rhizomous. So I'll come in and show you. These leaves are the remnants of the previous growths and flower points. And in fact, they now pass on the energy to the next growth points. So what we've got, each of the two previous growth points, which I had 2 flowers last year, has each produced 2 more. So we are now starting to grow exponentially. So hopefully each of these growth points will produce 2. So maybe next year I'll have 6 flower spikes, and within a few years I'll have a pot full, which will be absolutely stunning. It is a slow burn though, and I think you really need to keep the nutrition up to plants like this, woodland plants. They do need a lot of fertilizer, because you imagine in the wild, every season they're getting a drop of deciduous or semi-deciduous leaves. So there's going to be lots of beautiful humus-rich soil that they're living in, which is a natural fertilizer and giving it plenty of nutrition to draw on. So feed it well at the beginning of the season, I would. Then the last thing is moisture. It is classic woodland in that regard. I think that it does want to be kept moistish. I did read in one reference that it is remarkably drought tolerant. Well, I'm not going to risk that, and I don't let mine dry out ever. It's one of those things I always keep my eye on and keep them well watered. Now I have got a couple of others, and the other one is just in spike 2, but it's going to be quite a bit later than this. And I bought a third one, which is an unknown seedling. And the mother plant that I saw, in fact, I'll link the short that I made about it, was the most incredible golden color. So my hope against hope is that that smaller one is actually as golden as the one that I'm showing you, because it was the most beautiful thing. So there we are, plant lovers. Calanthe, I've got to check the name again. Aristulifera, I'm probably not saying that correctly, but I'm sure someone will correct me. It's the most beautiful thing. Not an easy orchid to come by, but I think if you've got the right climate, terrestrial orchids are so easy, because literally treat them as a garden plant. It is going to take a while to bulk up, but never mind. We're here for the long haul, plant lovers. And if you're here for the long haul, you will have to hit subscribe and see what I'm doing next week. There'll be something equally delicious in bloom, I feel. So until then, my ground orchid, my Calanthe, and I wish you farewell. Take care wherever you are. And I look forward to seeing you next week.